Good morning. Thank you for staying at home and for watching us here at Abralin ao Vivo, Linguists Online. This project is organized by the Brazilian Linguistics Association with cooperation with the Permanent International Committee of Linguists, the Latin American Association of Linguists and Philology, the Argentinian Society of Language Studies, and the Linguistic Society of America. I am Mahayana Godoy from Natal, Brazil, and I was given the honor to introduce cognitive and neuroscientist Evelina Fedorenko, who very kindly accepted our invitation. Professor Fedorenko is an associate professor at the Department of Brain and Cognitive Sciences at the MIT, where she runs the Ed Fedorenko's Language Lab. Her research focuses on cognitive and neuromechanisms that enable us to produce and understand language. She agreed to answer a few questions after the talk, so I'll be reading your comments while she talks and choosing some questions you may have. You may post your questions in English. If you type them in Portuguese and Spanish, I can read. Any other language, I'm afraid that I will not be able to do that, sorry. So thank you. And now let's watch the talk, The Language System and the Human Mind and Brain.
Great, thank you so much for having me. Let me just do the screen share. And hopefully it still works. All right, can you guys see my slide? Yeah, okay, great. So I like to start my talks often by saying that language can be construed as a shortcut for telepathy. And in the next 50 minutes or so, I'm going to use sequences of words to transmit some ideas from my head into yours. Just to situate us a little bit, to do this, I'm going to draw on my stored language knowledge representations to encode my ideas, abstract thoughts, into linguistic utterances, which is a code that we share with other conspecifics. Our language knowledge is rich and has been much debated in many fields, its nature and abstractness, but unambiguously it contains some knowledge of the sounds of the language, of the words of the language, and some probabilistic constraints on how sounds can combine to form words and how words can combine to form phrases and sentences. And once I have prepared my utterance in my head or a part of my utterance, I can send it down to the articulation system as I'm doing today, or of course to other parts of the motor cortex if I'm writing or typing my messages. And on your side, you're going to be trying to decode the utterances I'm producing, going from perceptual input. In this case, you're going to be dealing with auditory speech perception, to trying to extract the words, sequences of words that I'm producing, and then finally extracting a more abstract representation of my thought. And communicative success occurs when the active content of my mind is approximately similar to the active content of your mind. Over the years, we've worked a little bit on all of these different components of the language system and cognition more broadly. I'll say just a few words about the components that we don't focus on, and then spend the rest of the time talking about high-level language comprehension. So each of the perceptual and motor components of language is now known to be supported by a separate set of mental computations implemented in distinct parts of the brain. So just to briefly say what I mean, for example, our speech perception relies on a region within high-level auditory cortex, and it's highly specialized for speech perception compared to many, many other kinds of sounds. But this perceptual system doesn't seem to care much about the meaningfulness of the signal. So these speech perception regions will respond just as much when you listen to foreign speech that you don't understand, or to speech made up of non-words, as it does to speech in your native language, suggesting that what it cares about is the acoustics of the speech signal as opposed to the content. And similarly, on this visual language processing, there is a part of the visual cortex known as the visual word form area, which responds very strongly and highly selectively to letters in the script that's familiar to you, but not to any other kinds of stimuli, including very similar ones like unfamiliar scripts. Again, this region cares about the perceptual features of the visual linguistic input, but doesn't seem to care much about content. Now, the part that my work has mostly focused on is this question of how we infer thoughts, high-level meanings from linguistic utterances. And we discovered a few things over the years. I'll highlight some of these things in this talk. But before I do this, I just want to outline more generally the main directions that we're pursuing, so that if you guys want to talk more about some of this in the question period, we can do that. Okay, so the first question, like I mentioned, that we've mostly focused on has to do with language comprehension. So what are the knowledge representations that we use to infer meanings from linguistic utterances, and what computations underlie this process? Getting to the algorithmic level of description in domains like language is quite challenging, absent abundant single cell physiology data and the ability to precisely lesion different parts of the system to examine their core contributions or to manipulate the input that the system gets developmentally. However, I would say we've been able to make some progress here, and I'll highlight some findings in a little while. A much harder thing to study is language production. Self-generated complex behaviors are notoriously challenging to probe, but it's what we do about half the time when we use language, so it seems important to study this as well. This line of work is still at the early stages, but we're learning some interesting things, including some potential differences in how the high-level language system supports comprehension and production, given that the computational goals of the two are quite distinct. Another line of work lies at the intersection of language and social cognition. So language processing typically takes place in social contexts, where we're not only getting the linguistic signal, but also an abundance of other communicative cues, from so-called extra-linguistic cues in the speech signal, like intonation cues, not what you say, but how you say it, to non-linguistic vocalizations, like laughs and sighs and gasps, to visual cues like eye gaze, facial expressions, and hand gestures. And somehow we seemingly effortlessly integrate all these different kinds of information into a coherent representation of the speaker and their message. Much evidence now suggests, including some work from our group, that these different kinds of communicative signals are processed by distinct mechanisms. So we have brain areas that specialize for processing facial expressions, brain areas that specialize for processing intonation cues, and so on. But how these different kinds of signals are bound together is not yet understood. Intriguingly, in the first ever fMRI study of social interaction in macaques, observation of socially relevant signals was shown to recruit a system that eerily resembles the topography of the human language network shown here on the left, the study by Shepard of Freiwald. And to me, this points to a deep evolutionary link between language and social cognition, perception and cognition more broadly, and we're trying to understand how exactly this link may have given rise to the systems that we have in the modern brain. Another line of work asks about how we represent meanings. This is a big and difficult question. We all know that already by age 4 or 5, we know a hell of a lot about the world. And here we're trying to figure out the nature of these conceptual representations. In some work with Francisco Pereira, we found that using distributional models of semantics, where meanings of words are represented as their patterns of concurrence with other words in the language, we can robustly decode meanings from linguistic utterances using brain images of people reading words or sentences. But how exactly meanings are represented in that broad landscape that we can use to decode this information remains very poorly understood. So for example, are meanings tied to our sensory and motor experiences in the world, or are they more abstract? What is the dimensionality of semantic knowledge? What are the core dimensions? And how do these conceptual representations interface with linguistic ones, which is what's needed to communicate successfully. We're also looking at how our minds and brains reorganize following damage to the language system and other parts of the brain. So, for example, here's a brain of an individual who suffered a massive left hemisphere stroke around age 65. You can see all the atrophied tissue shown in white. And in this case, the damage encompasses the entire language system. So this individual is severely impaired in both understanding and producing language, and has a diagnosis of a condition known as global aphasia, which kind of speaks for itself. So everything linguistic is impaired. And here's the brain of another individual who has a similar extent of damage, but she lost her temporal lobe as a result of a stroke episode that likely occurred during or shortly after birth. Now, this person didn't know that anything was different in her brain until she was about 20, when she participated in a routine EEG exam and the electrodes weren't picking up any signals, and she was advised to get an MRI. So we're trying to understand how brains reorganize following both early and late damage. So for early damage, we're trying to figure out whether where the language system ends up, if it can't go in the place where it would normally go, and whether it shows all the same properties and functionality as what we see in neurotypical individuals, and how the brain copes with the necessary crowding that occurs when a substantial part of the brain may be missing. By crowding, I mean different functions having to now fight for the same limited amount of real estate. And for cases of late damage, we're trying to understand why some people recover their language functions much better than others. And in particular, we're looking at potential contributions of domain general executive mechanisms to the recovery process. And finally, we're exploring inter-individual variation in the neural architecture of language, asking how exactly it varies and how this variability relates to behavior and genetic makeup. And we're looking at variability both among neurotypical individuals, which vary substantially, as well as looking at differences between, say, neurotypical individuals and individuals with developmental disorders like autism or other disorders that affect communication, as well as individuals with superior linguistic abilities. So, for example, hyperpolyglots who have mastered 10 or 20 or 50 languages in adulthood. And we're trying to ask how are their brains different so that they can do that. To address these various questions, we use a number of approaches. We started out by using functional MRI. That has been the primary approach for a number of years, but we also supplemented with EEG and ERP studies, more recently MAG as well. And in collaboration with several other groups, we're using intracranial recordings and stimulation, as well as genetic analysis and more recently computational modeling, trying to relate state-of-the-art deep neural net models of language to neural representations of language processing in the human brain. Okay, so to introduce us to the notion of the language network, which the term I use quite frequently. When I say the language network, I'm referring to a set of left hemisphere regions in the frontal and temporal cortex that are active when we interpret linguistic utterances above and beyond lower level perceptual processes like the ones I mentioned a little bit earlier, like speech perception or visual letter recognition. You can find these regions quite easily by contrasting neural responses to language with some perceptually matched but not interpretable stimuli. So you can contrast people reading or listening to sentences versus lists of non-words like blick or florp. Or you can contrast people listening to speech in their native language versus speech in an unfamiliar foreign language, or speech that has been muffled to sound like bad radio reception where it sounds like speech, but you can't extract any information from it. And you can actually recover this network quite well without any test contrast whatsoever, simply by looking at covariation in voxel-wise correlations across so-called naturalistic cognition. So you just look at, across the brain, you look at patterns of how responses go up and down over time, and you can recover this network quite well from just those data without contrasting any test conditions. My group has developed robust methods for quickly and reliably identifying this network in individual participants. And this is important given the variability that exists in the precise locations of these areas across people. So I'm showing you here 4 individual participants, and you can see that the overall landscape is similar, as would be expected, because we know that there is all sorts of stability in the functional architecture across people, but the precise topography varies quite a bit. And now we have over 800 individuals in our database that we've tested over the years, and we're trying to quantify this variability very systematically across this large population. These activations, so this is again for a contrast between language and a perceptual image control condition. These activations are robust to changes in materials, task, modality of presentation, you could be reading or listening, as well as language, which language you're processing. So in recent work, we have generalized this basic typography and some of its key properties to over 40 diverse languages from 10 distinct language families. So here are sample activation maps from native speakers of 41 languages. And as you can see, although it's these maps are small, but the basic topography is the same. And some other properties like the ones I'll tell you about in the rest of the talk seem to be shared across these diverse populations as well. So the regions of the language network exhibit a few important characteristics. So this is still just laying some foundational knowledge here so that we can then tackle the questions I'll focus on. So these regions respond during both language comprehension and production. They're very strongly functionally integrated, meaning that from the pattern of activity of one language region, you can very well predict something about the pattern of activity of another brain region in the system, which makes it sometimes challenging to study potential differences among the different regions. These regions' activity is very tightly linked to the stimulus, as can be revealed by a method developed by Uri Hassan a few years ago, like known as intersubject correlation. So looking at how similar the patterns of up and down fluctuations are for the same brain region across different individuals. And at least a subset of the system is causally important for language. So this is actually where we started with in the field back from Broca's and Wernicke's discoveries years ago, where if you damage some parts of the system, you end up with difficulties in some aspects of language production and or comprehension. So this language network appears to be what I call a natural kind. It's robustly separable from the rest of the brain. It's strongly internally integrated, and it's stable within individuals over time. So in the rest of this talk, I will pose and answer 3 questions about the functional architecture of the system. First, I will ask whether the brain regions that support language processing are specialized for processing linguistic input, or instead also support other mental processes that have been argued to share computations with language. Next, I will probe a core distinction within language between syntax, the structure of sentences, and word meanings, and test whether different regions within this network support these 2 aspects of language. And finally, I will test whether the response in the language network is predominantly driven by structure building or by semantic composition, by which I mean creating complex meanings from simpler ones. So given the evolutionarily late emergence of language, does it rely on specialized mechanisms, or does it share machinery with other high-level cognitive processes? If you look across the literature, you'll find abundant claims about language making use of the same mechanisms that we use to perform other cognitive tasks, from arithmetic to domain general executive functions like working memory or attention, to music perception, to observing and interpreting others' actions or gestures, to some aspects of social cognition. However, I believe that a lot of these claims resulted from reliance on flawed methodologies and reverse inferences from anatomy to function. So for example, observing activation for an action perception task in what people call Broca's area, and taking that to reflect overlap with language. But Broca's area, as it's been defined in the literature, often encompasses quite large portions of the frontal lobe, and there's a lot going on in the frontal lobe. So to argue for overlap, it is critical to examine overlap directly. And I've argued it's also critical to examine this within individual participants. So what we did is just that. We defined language responsive regions in each individual separately, and then we asked, do these same regions that respond robustly to linguistic stimuli, are they active when you're doing arithmetic, or when you're listening to music, or when you're watching other people's meaningful actions? And so here's the response profile of one sample region and the posterior temporal cortex. In black and gray are responses to people processing sentences and sequences of non-words. 0 here is just a baseline of your brain activity when you have no stimuli presented, so just looking at a blank screen. and then everything is plotted relative to that fixation. And in different colors, you see responses to diverse kinds of tasks noted here above. And as you can see, non-linguistic tasks elicit responses that cluster around 0, and all are lower than responses to our control condition in the localizer task, which is what we call this task with which we find the language responsive areas. So one way to think about this is that this region works as hard when you're doing arithmetic as it does when you're looking at a blank screen. So it really, really is not engaged. And strikingly, here's a response of another region located right around Broca's area, which has been argued to be highly multifunctional and share machinery with many, many other non-linguistic tasks. And the profile is largely the same. And in fact, you find this high selectivity for linguistic input across the whole frontotemporal network. It's important to know that all of these non-linguistic tasks, of course, elicit very robust responses in other parts of the brain. It just so happens that those areas do not overlap with the areas that process linguistic input. Another point that's worth making here is that this strong functional specialization that we observe in an adult brain does not imply innateness. We know that specialization can develop as a function of our experience with the world. So one region that I alluded to at the beginning of the talk, the visual word form area in your visual cortex, very clearly develops experientially, because of course we cannot have innate machinery for reading because it's a skill we acquire quite late in our lives. And yet the regions that support the low-level visual perception during reading in our brains are highly specialized for that input compared to any other visual stimulus. So this is a clear example of experientially driven functional specialization developing. And I would argue that the language system plausibly develops in a similar way. As we acquire language, we learn meanings of words, meanings of constructions. Those mappings between forms and meanings have to be stored somewhere. And I would argue that this frontotemporal system is exactly where these learned representations are stored and then used to both interpret incoming signals during comprehension and generate outgoing signals during production. A complementary approach to address the question of whether language shares machinery with other neural functions, with other mental functions, is to examine abilities of individuals who lack a properly functioning language system. And most telling are cases of global aphasia, which again, I already mentioned at the beginning. So this is, these are cases of severe damage resulting from damage to effectively the entire frontotemporal system and perisylvian cortex, typically due to a large stroke, although other etiologies can do that as well. And this damage leads to profound deficits in both producing and understanding language. My colleague Rosemary Varley at UCL has been studying this population for a while now, and over the years, she and her colleagues examined a broad range of non-linguistic abilities, including some of the ones that I mentioned that we looked at using functional imaging in neurotypical individuals. And it's quite striking. It was striking to me when I first was learning about this work, that these individuals who are severely, severely impaired in language can nevertheless do arithmetic. They can reason causally about the world. They can appreciate structure and music. They can navigate spatially using the same kinds of cues as neurotypical individuals, and they can reason about others' minds. So this evidence suggests that a lot of complex thought and high-level cognition can take place without the language system. At least once the brain and mind are formed in adulthood, you can wipe out our ability to map between thoughts and utterances, and we can't communicate about things anymore. But a lot of the thought processes remain the same, suggesting that it cannot be the case that language is a requirement for high-level thought. An important caveat, of course, is that this evidence does not speak to the potential role that language may play in the development of some of these high-level capacities. And in fact, at least for some of these abilities, some evidence suggests that language may be critical in the development of those abilities. a prime example, perhaps the best case we have, is for development of some aspects of social cognition, where not having access to linguistic input early on in development will lead to the delay in the development of a full-blown theory of mind ability, or the ability to think about others' mental representations. Okay, so the language system is not engaged in and does not appear to be needed for non-linguistic cognition. Instead, the mechanisms that support language appear to be highly specialized for interpreting linguistic signals. And this selectivity already places important constraints on the kinds of computations that the language regions carry out. For example, the fact that the language regions don't respond to arithmetic or music rules out a class of ideas about the existence of abstract hierarchical structure processor, at least about the reliance of language on such a processor, even if such exists. But we're still far from understanding what these regions do exactly. So now onto the question of whether distinct subsets of the system process syntactic structure versus word meanings. Okay, so it seems almost intuitive that when we process sentences, we're performing two distinct computations. On the one hand, we're looking up the meanings of individual words. And on the other hand, we're figuring out the categories of these words, like whether it's a noun or a verb, and how these words go together into phrases to create the meaning of the entire sentence. This divide between word meanings and syntactic processing has been prominent in language research for many years, and all the leading proposals of the neural architecture of language currently postulate a distinct syntax or combinatorics selective component. However, this divide has also been long questioned. So many have observed that our grammatical knowledge does not operate over general categories like nouns and verbs. And a classic example, of course, is our knowledge of verbs. So to shiver, to comfort, and to put are all verbs, yet how they combine with other words is quite different. So shiver only requires a subject. You can say I shivered, and that's fine. Comfort requires a patient, so someone who is comforted. You can't say I comforted, this doesn't make sense. You need to say who you comforted. And put is more complex, still requiring both some object of putting and the location. So you can't say I put a book, you have to say I put a book on the shelf. In other words, there are verb-specific constraints on combinatorics. And so current linguistic frameworks incorporate word knowledge as part of the knowledge of the grammars, known as lexicalized grammars. And experimental and corpus work in psycholinguistics have established that people are exquisitely sensitive to contingencies between particular words and the constructions that they occur in, as well as observing correlations between people's lexical abilities, so their knowledge and use of words, with their grammatical abilities above and beyond shared variance due to something like general fluid intelligence. So linguistic mechanisms that were early on proposed to be distinct instead appear to be tightly integrated. And in line with the strong integration that has emerged from linguistic theorizing, experimental work and corpus studies, and more recently computational modeling, I'm going to question the existence of brain regions that support syntactic processing, but not the processing of word meanings. And my argument will have two components. First, I will show you that syntactic processing is not localized to a particular region within the language network, but is rather distributed across it. And second, I will show you that any region that is sensitive to syntax is at least as sensitive to individual word meanings. Okay, so over the last few decades, a number of proposals have been put forward that arguing that syntactic processing takes place in a particular brain region. The most famous account places syntactic processing in some part of the inferior frontal cortex, or so-called Broca's area, although I detest the term quite strongly. And to clarify here, if somebody is arguing that syntactic processing is localized to, say, some portion of Broca's area, they imply, although sometimes indirectly, that other language regions, say the posterior temporal or the anterior temporal regions, do not support syntactic processing. Okay, so it's a spatial specificity for a particular area. But others have proposed that posterior temporal cortex, in fact, is the key syntactic hub. And some others have argued that it's the anterior temporal cortex that does the core, performs the core syntactic computations. And some others have proposed that maybe it's a kind of multi-region system, but still a subset of the full language network. This lack of consensus already should give you some clues that something is up. if people are coming with fundamentally different answers from different studies and different approaches, that suggests that maybe none of those answers are right, or possibly one of them is, but nevertheless, something still needs to be figured out. What are the kinds of evidence that people have used to argue that syntax is localized to, say, Broca's area? Well, one common strategy has been to examine manipulations of syntactic complexity, which comes in many different forms. Here's just one example. You can take a sentence that contains a subject extracted relative clause, like the senator that attacked the reporter was tall, where all the dependencies are local, compared to an object extracted counterpart, like the senator that the reporter attacked was tall, where now there's a non-local dependency that exists between senator and attack. So when you get to attack, you have to perform a non-local retrieval operation of an earlier encountered element. And stronger responses to the latter kind of sentences, the more complex sentences, have been taken as evidence that greater, more complex syntactic computations have to take place. And so, for example, this is a figure from one of Angela Federici's reviews showing activation within Broca's area for this kind of manipulations. However, just because a region doesn't emerge as showing a significant effect in a traditional group analysis where you average brains together and look for patterns of commonality, doesn't mean that the region, in fact, is not sensitive to the manipulation of interest, because the standard analyses, as I and others have argued, are vastly underpowered. So if you apply the kinds of approaches that I've mentioned, where you identify language responsive areas in each individual separately, and then you ask, do these regions respond to some manipulation of interest? So in this case, to a syntactic complexity manipulation, you very robustly replicate the findings that inferior frontal regions respond to syntactic complexity. So again, in black and white here are responses to our localizer conditions. And then in dark and light gray are responses to sentences with harder syntax versus easier syntax. But we also find this response very robustly in posterior temporal cortex and in the rest of the language system as well. So it appears that syntactic processing is ubiquitous across the language network rather than being spatially restricted to a particular area or subset of it. And I should say that studies of patients with brain damage have also failed to consistently link syntactic comprehension deficits with a particular locus within the language network, leading quite a few people now to argue that syntactic processing is supported by the language network as a whole. Okay, but are some of these regions that are sensitive to syntax selective for syntax over the processing of word meanings? In other words, do any of these regions show sensitivity to manipulations like the syntactic complexity manipulations, maybe just process the structure of the sentence without caring much about the lexical content? And some studies, like the ones I've showed you, have implied such selectivity, given that the words in the sentences are the same. And so the reasoning as well, it must have to do with the complexity of the structure. But this reasoning is fundamentally flawed. A region could be sensitive to syntax as well as word meanings. And this kind of manipulation simply doesn't probe sensitivity to word meaning processing. So how can we examine responses to syntax and word meanings together? So one common paradigm varies the presence of syntactic versus lexical information in the linguistic signal. So you can cross the presence of structure and word meanings in a simple 2x2 design. So far we've been talking about sentences a lot. So sentences obviously consist of real interpretable words, and words further combine to form phrases and sentences that are also interpretable in this more global meaning of the sentence. If you take a sentence and replace each word by some match word and scramble words around, you get something like a list of unconnected words, like what interfere it bags, blink towel off with precocious does bags. So each of the words is individually interpretable, but they don't cohere into phrases or sentences. On the other hand, you can take a sentence frame and replace each content word with a word that sounds like a word but is not interpretable. So it sounds like these materials are known as Jabberwocky, following Lewis Carroll, who originally introduced these materials, although not for experimental research. It sounds like when a plot spouse into a filmer, the magical plot will miss and bore. So this sounds like jargon. So if you go to a talk where somebody is using a lot of jargon, it sounds kind of like this. You know that there are sentences, you can detect some structure, you can figure out which element is the subject or the object of the sentence, but you can't extract much higher level meaning. Hopefully this is not your experience during this talk. And then finally, we have a condition where you can scramble these Jabberwocky sentences. And so now you have neither the sentence frame consisting of function words and functional morphemes, nor the individual words being interpretable. In this version, we do preserve some function words. It doesn't really matter. You can replace function words with similar length non-words, and it works the same. But the point here is that now we have this, we filled out this 2x2 design. And the question is whether there are some brain regions and correspondingly cognitive mechanisms that care more strongly about word meanings. So showing a profile where they respond a lot to sentences and word lists compared to conditions where there are no real interpretable words like Jabberwocky and non-word lists. And other separate regions that show selective sensitivity to structure, like responding a lot to sentences and Jabberwocky sentences, which are structured but meaningless, more so than to the two unstructured conditions like lists of words and lists of non-words. And the bottom line is that we don't find either of these profiles anywhere in the language network. Instead, what you find very robustly and very consistently across languages, paradigms, and participants is that is a profile where you have two clear main effects. So sentences elicit a very strong response. The two conditions that either have word meanings or structure without interpretable content, an intermediate condition, and non-words, the lowest response. So for example, here's just showing you some actual data. So here's a response of an inferior frontal region. This is from one of our earlier data sets published in 2010. And here's a replication with a different set of materials from different participants just a few years ago. And sometimes you see the two middle conditions vary a little bit in which one is higher, but the overall pattern of two main effects is what you see most consistently across regions and across studies. And again, this pattern is present across the whole network. I should mention, when I show these regions in red here, these are regions that, these are what we call parcels. So these are broad masks that we use to constrain the definition of individual regions. So in any given person, the language responsive area is a very small fraction of this large area. So it's not like these whole areas are probed here. This is just showing you the rough locations of these different regions that we're probing. And in each given person, we're selecting the language responsive voxels, chunks of the brain within that mask. Okay, so a few years ago, I got worried that maybe fMRI is just functional brain imaging is just not as sensitive, or the spatial resolution is not high enough. And so we teamed up with some people who collect intracranial recording data and tried the same paradigm using that method, which is vastly more sensitive. So this is an approach where grids of electrodes are placed directly on the surface of the human brain. This is typically done in patients undergoing surgery for intractable or drug-resistant epilepsy. And basically the approach there is that you get an electrode grid implanted, then you wait for a seizure to happen, which sometimes takes a few days. And then using the pattern of how these electrodes picked up abnormal activity when the seizure started, you try to triangulate where the seizure originated and remove epileptogenic cortex. But while you're waiting for a seizure, the patient is in the hospital, and we can kindly ask them to do some cognitive tasks, which most are very happy to do. And so this is now recording, this is not single cell recording, this is recording local field potentials, but it's much higher spatial resolution than functional MRI. And again, using the same basic paradigm, we find the same pattern, except that the word list condition elicits a consistently stronger response than the Jabberwocky sentences. but no, and so this is averaging across a few language responsive electrodes that we've had across a few patients, but there's no individual electrode that shows selectivity for syntactic structure over word meanings, although there are many electrodes that show a preference for word meanings over syntactic processing. But again, you can say this is just one paradigm. So we've looked at pretty much any paradigm that has been put forward to probe sensitivity to syntax versus word meanings. So you can look at paradigms that more strongly tax syntactic processing versus the processing of word meanings. So one common version of this is looking at different kinds of violations. So you can give people a context, like although his ears were damaged, the man could still, and then get an expected continuation like here, a continuation that doesn't make sense, like cook, or a continuation that makes sense, but is more of a syntactically not appropriate given the context. Or you can look at neural suppression or adaptation, relying on the very fundamental property of our brains, in that the response to the repeated information, the signal, is attenuated. So you can give people a sentence and then either give them a sentence that is exactly repeated, which will result in a lower response, or a sentence where the words change, or the sentence where the structure changes, but the meaning stays the same. And across these and some other paradigms, we consistently find sensitivity to both the lexical semantic manipulation and the syntactic manipulation. So this is just a couple of different regions showing reliable responses to these blue and red conditions in each of these regions. Okay, so the bottom line of all this is that any region that responds to syntactic processing appears to be at least as sensitive to meanings of individual words. So the very same regions that support lexical processing are the ones that support syntactic processing. And as I mentioned, these results are actually very nicely in line with the behavioral evidence that also suggests strong integration between words and structure building, including with linguistic approaches like construction grammars and usage-based grammars, where there's no sharp distinction drawn between words and more complex structure representations. As well as with recent fMRI evidence from studies that I mentioned again at the beginning of the talk, where you can use semantic model, distributional semantic models of meaning to decode linguistic meanings from brain images. And generally you find very robust decoding of individual concepts, but also sentences across the whole language system, suggesting that there is robust representations of individual concepts, meaning individual word meanings throughout that system. And of course, we know that some of those regions also care about syntax, so, again, pointing to the fact that it's the very same areas that perform both of these kinds of mental operations. In an effort to keep searching for a potential selectivity for syntax, we're currently trying to kind of go to the cutting edge of methodologies. So we're trying some laminar imaging studies. So these are very high resolution brain imaging studies where you're trying to dissociate information present in different kinds of cortical layers. And there's differences that we know about from animal work, that some layers seem to be more driven by bottom-up processes and others by top-down processes. So there may be some, to the extent that we find any differential loading of syntactic versus lexical processes on these different kinds of layers, we may be able to understand something about those processes to the if they are different and how they may work together. As well as looking at single cell intraoperative recordings, which is sometimes very rarely available in some cases of brain surgery, where you, in addition to the standard electrodes that record local field potentials, you also have micro contacts, which can contact single cells. And so we're trying to see if there is any evidence of structure selectivity in any of those more even more fine-grained methods. Okay, so let's see. So now on to this last question of what this response, strong response to sentences is about. So just like a face is the preferred stimulus of the fusiform face area, it appears that a sentence is definitely the preferred stimulus of the language regions. But what is it about these sentences what is it about sentences that makes them so appealing to the system? Which of course is one potential host of cues about what the computations are that these regions carry out. So as I already told you, we find this robust preference with both functional MRI and electrocorticography, these intracranial recording methods. And interestingly, in electrocorticography, in these methods where we record directly from the brain and where we have very fine grained temporal resolution, we also find an interesting, what we call build-up effect, which is present for sentences, but not any other conditions. So this is neural responses as a function of word position in the sentence. So this is just, the cat chased the dog all day long or something like that. And you see that the response to the sentence condition keeps increasing as you move on further in the sentence. And we saw no similar hint of a buildup for the Jabberwocky condition. So this is this structured sentence with no meaning, the red condition. And so based on this, and this result has now been replicated by Stendy Haynes group as well, this build-up effect for sentences. And so given what we saw no hint of a similar effect in the Jabberwocky condition, we argue that this effect reflects something about the evolving complexity of the meanings that you build as you proceed through the sentence. But still, a sentence is a structured stimulus, and we wanted to test more precisely whether the strong response to sentences is driven more strongly by the structure building operations or by compositional meaning construction. Let's talk a little about meaning. So language, I would argue, fundamentally has to do with meaning. I started this talk by saying that language is a powerful code that allows us to share thoughts with one another. And many features of language, including its syntactic properties, have now been shown to be shaped by communicative pressures to make information transfer as efficient as possible. Based on these considerations alone, I would already argue that it doesn't make sense to think of structure building as separate from meaning, because structure building is effectively one underlying mechanism for conveying complex meanings. But there is more. So over the last 10, 15 years, there's been an important shift in the field of sentence processing, where researchers started acknowledging that the input that we get is not pristine sequences of structured words, but instead is quite noisy. We make speech errors and typos, we mishear things, we talk to kids and foreigners who don't have the full command of the grammar, etc. And so as a result of the kind of input we get, our language processing mechanism must have ways of coping with this noise. And this notion, of course, is not new. It was formally introduced by Claude Shannon back in the 40s within the context of communication theory. And the speech perception community has embraced this idea years ago, given that speech is notoriously noisy, but only in the last few years, including based on work by Roger Levy and Ted Gibson, people, and earlier ideas are due to Fernando Ferreira, where people started incorporating this idea of noise into high-level interpretation. And all cutting-edge models of comprehension include mechanisms for dealing with noise now. And empirically, a few studies have now shown that a plausible meaning can drive interpretation, overriding both local and global structural constraints. So you can get something that's syntactically quite garbled, but as long as there's a plausible meaning that's recoverable, you can process it just fine and ignore all sorts of grammatical inconsistencies that may be present. So we hypothesized that perhaps it's what the language system is primarily concerned with, given that a big function of language is communication, is constructing meanings, and it should basically work at full capacity as long as the input provides sufficient evidence for semantic composition. So what constitutes sufficient evidence for semantic composition? We have a pretty clear intuition about what words do versus don't go together in the input. So for example, if we encounter words like eat and apple or eat and restaurant in close proximity to one another, we can't help but try to put them together. But if we encounter words like eat and accordion, we may be less likely to do so. And there's likely a host of factors that affect whether a pair of words or a set of words are combinable. including both the properties of individual words and their relationships. And we're starting to systematically examine these factors in a new line of work. But for an initial approximation, we can take advantage of large corpora, which serve as a good proxy for our linguistic experience, as well as world knowledge. And we can calculate point-wise mutual information for any pair of words. So point-wise mutual information is basically a notion from information theory that measures mutual dependence between variables, and in this case, words. So it's basically a ratio of the joint probability of two words, of how often words occurred in proximity to each other, over the product of their independent probabilities, so how frequent the words are on their own. And so we can say perhaps that semantic composition takes place as long as point-wise mutual information among the words within some local context is above some threshold, let's say at the level comparable to that present in real naturalistic input. I mentioned locality here. So within a local context, this locality constraint is intuitive. If you get a word like eat and then 5 minutes later, a word like apple, it's not going to do you any good, and you're probably not going to try to integrate them. And this constraint presumably rises because of the intrinsic limited memory limitations capacity of the brain, perhaps also with from our implicit knowledge that words that tend to form semantic dependencies tend to be near each other linearly. So the critical idea here is that we can and will try to combine words like eat and apple, even if the syntactic structure within which they occur does not support their semantic composition. Yeah, it's just the formula that I mentioned. Okay, so to evaluate this idea, we devised a novel manipulation that does not affect local point-wise mutual information, but does affect syntactic structure. In particular, we started out with 12-word long sentences, and we introduced local scrambling manipulation. So we took a pair of adjacent words and swapped them, or we did this a few different times and more, up to 7 swaps. So once you get to 7 swaps, the sentence becomes really pretty destroyed structure-wise. However, as you can see from the color spectrum here, within any window of a few words, there are always words that are similar in color, which basically indicates adjacent words based on the original sentence, right? So within some local context, you can always put words together and make complex meanings, build complex phrases and clauses out of them. So this manipulation maintains local semantic coherence. And if we measure mutual information for these materials, this is just kind of showing you that this manipulation is as we intended. The mutual information within local context stays high and is much higher than that of a list of unconnected words. So if the strong response to sentences is driven by structure building, we would expect to see a drop-off as the structure becomes more and more degraded, a drop-off in the neural response. However, if the strong response is driven by meaning, we would expect the response to stay flat because the meanings are composable even in these structurally degraded conditions. And here's what we find. So again, in this study, the materials are presented visually, 1 word at a time. And as in many prior studies, the sentences elicit responses that are much stronger than responses to unconnected lists of words or lists of non-words. However, degrading the sentences by introducing local word swaps does not decrease the magnitude of the language network's response. So even stimuli with 7 word swaps, like these ones, elicit as strong a response as veridical, well-formed, meaningful sentences. So it seems like it's not really structure, but meaning composition that explains the strong responses to sentences. Now remember, I emphasized the importance of the local context, and I argued that semantic composition takes place as long as the mutual information among the words within a local context is above some threshold. So to directly test the importance of locality, we introduced another condition in a second experiment where we tried to minimize local mutual information. So unlike this condition with 7 local swaps, we tried to scramble things in a way that would place any 2 words that are adjacent in the original sentence as far from each other as possible. So now again, you can see it reflected in the color spectrum, which is just for illustrative purposes, of course, that the local color spectrum is much more discontinuous, suggesting that words that were nearby in the original stimulus are now far apart. All right, and again, if we measure mutual information, it's much lower in these stimuli by design. And in the brain, we replicate this pattern where up to 5 swaps, the response stays strong and flat. And in the condition where you do this extensive scrambling where locally there is no longer semantic coherence present, you get a substantial drop in the response where the response is now not different from a list of totally unconnected words, suggesting that this locality component is indeed important. So semantic composition appears to take place as long as the words within a local context are related to each other sufficiently strongly, but not otherwise. Okay, so to summarize the key messages, I've shown you that the language regions are highly selective for language and not engage in a wide variety of non-linguistic processes, suggesting that language is not a prerequisite for complex thought. At least in an adult brain, when all the capacities are formed, you can take away the ability to translate between thoughts and utterances, and a lot of complex thought can proceed absolutely fine. I've also provided evidence against the existence of pure syntax processing brain areas contra many leading proposals of the neural architecture of language. Instead, the evidence quite strongly suggests that any region that cares about the structure of sentences also cares about individual word meanings. And finally, I've shown you that the language regions are primarily driven by semantic composition as opposed to structure building, which has been the focus of a lot of theorizing and empirical work for many years. But I would argue is quite misguided, and the focus should shift more towards understanding meanings and how we get meanings across from one mind to the next. And with this, I will end, and I'm happy to answer any questions. And I want to thank all our funding sources and my lab members. Thank you.
Thank you. Just a second.
Sure, no rush.
I feel like I am the subject of a executive function experiment, because I have to listen in English and check the questions in Portuguese and sometimes in English. And
yeah, that sounds intense. I don't want your job.
It was challenging, but
yeah.
It can be done. It can be done. So thank you very much for this wonderful talk, Evelyn. We have some questions. We have lots of questions. Actually, we won't have time to go through all the questions. Thank you for everyone who sent us questions during the talk. I have some here that addresses some of the points you mentioned. The first one I have is from Amanda Post, and she said, "Great talk. I have a question." Thank you, Amanda. Given that sentence building can be quite formulaic, how do you disentangle semantic meaning and sentence building? Do you control for frequency or of sentence composition? Do you have a control for frequency?
Well, so I don't know when this question came in the talk. So the last experiment was trying to do exactly that, right? It's trying to destroy structure while preserving the ability to locally compose words into complex meaning representations. We're trying to now do this a little more systematically by looking at the processing of pairs of words and sets of words that vary in all sorts of ways, including whether they're syntactically combinable, what is the kind of relationship that they form when they combine into a complex word, how often they co-occur, how similar they are in meaning, trying to paint a kind of richer picture of all the factors that might affect our ability to infer complex meanings from the input. But this third part was exactly trying to disentangle those things, so trying to destroy structure while preserving meaning. And looking at the processing of sentences like Jabberwocky sentences is an attempt to get meaning out of the equation, at least meaning that's interpretable with respect to our world knowledge. So you can still kind of figure out there's some entity that's doing something else to another entity, but it's a very abstract kind of meaning and not the kind that we typically infer. So I know it's hard to do follow-ups with these things, but hopefully that I'm happy to also, I should say that I'm quite available by to clarify questions by email. I'm very happy to answer follow-up things. I can't promise that it'll happen right away, but I'll get back to you for sure if you send me questions.
I have to mention that sometimes I am listening to you in Zoom, and people are listening to us in the future. Like what we are talking now, they will be listening like 2 or 3 minutes. That's why I had a problem when we started. So maybe when Amanda sent this question and I chose it, she hadn't seen it.
It's totally fine. Yeah, totally fine.
There's another one here that I was curious about that too. It's from Ferreira Hanna. I think it's Hanna Ferreira. I'm not sure. Is there any difference between children and adults' brains considering what was taken into account during the research? I don't know if you are doing research on language acquisition. And there's another question. Sorry, I forgot to see who made this question about how you consider the generative framework for language acquisition. So I think please, maybe these questions they combine. Like, what do you think about language acquisition?
I definitely think a lot about language acquisition. I think how we develop the capacity to communicate is one of the deepest questions there is. It's incredibly challenging to study the brains of kids at the age when the language acquisition goes through the roof, right? Which is between kind of, 8 months and 2.5 or 3 years of age. So there are some studies that look at brains of newborns, infants, typically, well, almost always during sleep, although some people are now trying to do functional studies with awake infants, which is incredibly challenging. And some claims that have come out of that work are that there are some early biases, hemispheric biases for speech. But of course, those studies are not going to tell you anything about whether language is innate, because a bias that emerges in a newborn infant for speech could also be happening as a result of their experience in utero, where they hear speech signals. And that's like the main thing that they hear for the last few months of being in the womb. And then there's studies of kids from around age 5 onwards. And what we find there, what people find there is that there seems to be a change in how strongly lateralized language processing is, such that if you look at a 5-year-old, you will find more bilateral processing. And then as you get older, processing becomes more left lateralized. And then as you age, it becomes again more bilateral. So there's kind of this U-shaped curve and lateralization changes. And the fact that the language processing looks to be more bilateral in kids, of course, is in line with this set of findings suggesting that you can have early brain damage, including in left hemisphere language cortex, and you seem to be able to recover just fine and appear totally normal for the purpose of linguistic processing. Now, I should say that, so the bottom line is we can't quite trace the trajectory of brain responses to language right in the sweet spot of when language becomes a core part of the cognitive arsenal. But my biases come are on the side of learning. I think humans are endowed with incredibly sophisticated learning mechanisms. Our brains grow 3 times from birth to adulthood. And there's a lot of very complicated kinds of structure that we can extract from the environment. So unless there is overwhelmingly strong evidence to postulate some innate constraints, my bias is to try to explain things with learning. And I would argue probably the main general learning mechanisms, which is contra some claims of language innateness, but I just think there's no evidence for those claims. And so we can.
It's a difficult question.
Yeah.
Let me see here. Well, we are talking about if it's learned, if it's not learned, and pragmatics play a role in learning language, of course. And we linguists, we have this tendency of what do we do with pragmatics? this is language, this is not language.
Mm-hmm.
So Eitan Bafa, he has a question here. And the question is, why is pragmatics processed at the opposite side of language processing? I mean, it's part of language, but it's processed at the right hemisphere for the most right-handed people. Why is that?
That's a great question. I really like that question. And in fact, we have one of our big funded projects is looking exactly at that question. I would say it's not clear that it's processed in the right hemisphere homologs of the language regions. Most evidence that people that I'm inferring here, this individual is referring to, comes from patients with right hemisphere damage who often have difficulties with non-literal language. But the right hemisphere has a lot of other stuff than just the right hemisphere language areas. So one very important region that resides actually very close to the right homologs of the language regions is a region known as the RTPJ, so right temporoparietal junction, so just an anatomical name. But the key thing about that region is that it's part of a totally distinct network that supports social reasoning. So it's a network that, for example, Rebecca Sachs at MIT, a colleague of mine, has been studying for many years. And that system seems to be engaged whenever we try to mentalize, whenever we try to think about what somebody else is thinking. And I suspect that a lot of the results from brain damage, where right hemisphere damage leads to problems with inference, pragmatic kind of inferences, actually is due to damage to that system. But in a systematic effort to understand this, we're now trying to take a wide range of non-literal language phenomena and look at the contributions of three systems. So the core language system that I talked about today, the system that supports social reasoning, including this RTPJ component that I mentioned, and a system that supports executive reasoning, which is again a totally separate extended frontoparietal network that is that enables us to do things like hold information active in working memory or inhibit irrelevant information or reason about the world. And the reason that we're looking at that system as well, that there's also some suggestions of executive contributions to pragmatic reasoning. And so the hope is to try to understand the division of labor among these three different mechanisms. The core language system, which I think is just reading out straight literal meanings. The contributions of the system that allows us to think about others' thoughts, which I think for some pragmatic phenomena is critically involved, and the contribution of these general executive resources, which may also play a role, especially under high demand situations where, for example, we're carrying a conversation with multiple people at the same time, and we have to keep track of who said what and who shares background information with what other person. Again, I'm happy if that person would like to email me, I can send some pointers to some work that's ongoing and some published.
Oi, this is your lead. You have other questions. There is another one here. It's before I take this question, maybe we'll have time for one more. I just want to tell you that a lot of people here is saying, great talk. I think it's their way of clapping because we didn't have the time to clap. When we do something, in YouTube, we cannot clap. So
well, thank
their
you.
way of clapping.
That's very nice.
So we have a new question here from Rosangela Gabriel. And she said, Jeff Ellman has argued that the structured knowledge is built on the word knowledge. What do you think of it? Because you're talking about what's driving composition is meaning.
Yeah, I very much, I think that's, I think Jeff was onto the right kinds of things. And in fact, connectionist networks were one source of evidence that suggested that a system where the very same units implement knowledge of words as well as combinatorial information can achieve some language tasks. Now, it's true that the early models, like the kinds that Jeff was publishing back in the 90s, they weren't doing that well on many language tests. And so a lot of people were at least then dismissive of those models. But now, with the advances in machine learning and computing power, we have deep neural nets that achieve remarkable success in capturing linguistic patterns. And in fact, we have some work going on where we're trying to take state-of-the-art language models, and we find that the best models that exist, like the transformer kind of architectures, which is one particular kind of deep neural net architectures, they pretty much explain all of the explainable variants in the patterns of neural response to language. So this is to say, so one thing to mention there is that oftentimes you'll see people criticizing these models because they seem to not be able to capture globally coherent thoughts. And in fact, some people describe these models as local coherence, global garbage or something like that. But I would argue that, and I have argued a little bit in this talk, that the structured thought representations are really quite distinct from the mapping that we have between different aspects of our world knowledge and linguistic forms. And the system that I talked about today does the latter and does not do complex thought. So I don't think we've solved thought with artificial neural networks, but I do think the current models are good enough to capture a lot of even pretty sophisticated aspects of linguistic regularities.
Yeah, I actually thought about Jeff Elman when you were presenting the restaurant, Apple restaurant, and restaurant, each accordion something, because we basically think on event structure. We think about events when we are processing language. And he was a great advocate.
That's exactly right. In fact, I think event structure is a very, very core component that may be key to get it. So when we get enough linguistic input to construct an event representation, that may be the time when we then abstract away from the linguistic form and convert it into a more abstract code that's kind of, abstract semantic representation. So that may be the limit at which we kind of chunk the input and convert it into representations that can then be used to higher level reason about things. So I think that's great.
Yeah. Changing a little bit the topic, maybe, well, I have just two more. I have a lot of questions, but maybe we can close with two questions that about a topic that you didn't mention, but it kept coming, the questions about bilinguals and multilingual speakers. Let me find the question here. Renan Ferreira, he asked, how does the brain reorganize as we learn new languages? I don't know if you have any research on that. And what is known about why bilinguals are able to code switch so easily, keeping their line of thought, even when the languages they know lack conceptual equivalences in some areas? And another question that is related, let me find it here. Can you tell more about your research on storytelling, story listening, brain, and how one, bi, or multilingual individuals process different languages in this case? So,
all good questions. We do have several lines of work on bi and multilingualism. So the second question is a little bit tricky because I don't think code switching is always easy. As a bilingual person myself, and especially in cases where there is no precise matching between the underlying conceptual representation, but there are slight differences in the underlying semantics, I think it can actually be quite challenging. So let me first say, so what we know about bilingualism in just a few words, right, is that it seems that unlike some of the earlier work, a few groups have now quite consistently found that in early bilinguals, people who are proficient in multiple languages, the languages are all represented and processed in the same system. So it's not like you rely on the right hemisphere homologs more. It's not like you rely on some executive domain general areas. It seems like if you're proficient in both languages, they both draw on the same system. And how exactly those languages are segregated within that system, I think is a hugely important and hard question. We know that in fine-grained patterns of activation patterns, we can discriminate between the languages very well. But again, there are some interesting puzzles, like to the extent that we take seriously the evidence from aphasia, where sometimes you have biases towards preservation or loss of one language over the other, it's very unclear to me how exactly that happens given that the implementation appears to be so interlinked at the level of regions. Now, a separate question is what happens when you acquire new languages in adulthood? And that's, I alluded to this very briefly at the beginning. We've been studying the brains of individuals who acquire many languages, like polyglots and hyperpolyglots. And most of these individuals acquire these languages in adulthood. So these are not people who grew up in, say, India and natively speak 5 different languages, but people who decide to learn languages in adulthood. And the finding we have from that line of work so far is that the language system of those individuals works less when they process language compared to monolingual individuals. So we're interpreting this as greater efficiency in dealing with linguistic input. But of course, we can't right now disentangle the possibilities. One, that they were born with a more efficient language processing system, and as a result, it may be easier for them to acquire new mappings between forms and meanings, or maybe as you get exposure to more and more languages and you learn about different structures, different patterns, you become better at processing linguistic input as a result of that experience. And so, of course, to answer those questions, you would want to have longitudinal studies of people as they acquire more and more languages and trace the changes in the response of the language system, which we haven't done, and I don't think anybody has done yet. But in terms of, I mean, I'll say just 2 words because there was this long and very well-liked claim that bilinguals tend to have advantages that spread beyond language, such that, for example, bilingual individuals may have better abilities to inhibit irrelevant information and generally, because they have to kind of engage these mechanisms all the time. It seems like that evidence is not, the evidence is not strong and consistent. So many groups have now failed to find these advantages in executive control abilities. So outside of the linguistic advantage that you know 2 languages, which is a great thing to have because you can read literature, you can travel and communicate with people who think potentially a little bit differently, it doesn't seem like you get extra bang on something like better ability to reason in general, or to inhibit irrelevant stuff, or to have better working memory capacity. So that's a little bit relevant to the second question, but I think there's, yeah.
Okay, thank you. I forgot to tell that one of the questions was from Tatiana Vasileva Costa. So Tatiana, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, it's been more than an hour. We could stay here for for longer, but we don't have time.
Yeah.
So I would like to thank you once again, Evelina, for the great talk you gave us today. Thank you everyone who is watching us, who are staying at home safe during these Corona times. And you can leave questions in the chat on YouTube. People who are watching us, you can do that. You can keep talking on YouTube if you want to. And we hope to see you again, see all of you again in our other lectures. So thank you, Evelina.
Thank you so much. Thanks. Stay safe, everyone.
Bye.